agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I'm joined by the professor of law at Chase Law School, Ken Katkin. Ken, we get to say goodbye to 2021 together in this special episode. Woohoo!
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
You don't seem so enthused about that, though.
2021 was not a great year, but I guess I was glad to have Biden in instead of Trump. But in other respects, I don't think this was anyone's idea of a great year.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that I would, I'm going to look forward to saying goodbye to, both personally and but yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that I think we want to talk about is, right? So what we're going to do this week is that we're going to do a little bit of a special show, Ken, right? I mean, we are probably some of the best. I mean, as any politics guys fan's going to know, we're probably the best predictors out of all the politics guys. I mean, I think you can agree.
Sure, I'll agree with that. Having not actually studied it scientifically, but I'll be happy to agree to that.
Intuitively, it has to be true, though. I mean,
yes, it does, yes.
And so because of that, what we kind of thought we would do is we take a look at some of the bigger trends of 2021. And then in all seriousness, try to think about what might 2022 look like as we're moving forward across a variety of landscapes. And so what Ken and I are going to do is we're going to talk and take a look at the durability of American democracy in 2022. We're going to talk about inflation, the economy, and the Fed in 2022. We're going to talk about what the pandemic is going to be looking like in 2022. And then maybe have some particularly early, but nevertheless interesting looks at midterm predictions and then presidential predictions. So even a little bit beyond there into 2022 to the extent that we want to. We'll also take a look at just a few stories. We're going to take a look at some cases dealing with the Proud Boys, Michael Flynn, and maybe if there's time even talk a little bit about the continuing crisis with Ukraine and Russia. And so that's where we're going to be headed. So we're going to take a brief pause and then we'll be back and get started with our predictions. Okay, so Ken, let's start by talking about some of the trends that we saw in 2021 that might help us more realistically make some predictions as we move forward and try to look into the future for 2022. I think for me, I don't think you're going to probably disagree, but I thought one of the biggest political landscape changes we saw was January 6th. And not just because of January 6th itself, but because of the whole steel movement that has really come to solidify and define the Republican Party. One of the things I noticed this week, I don't know if you've been paying attention, I'm always curious about poll numbers. Mitch McConnell this week is polling historically low among Republicans. And I think it's emblematic that even his soft version of there was no steel and now increasingly kind of January 6th committee curious, we'll put it that way, simply isn't the mainstream position. Yeah, right? I mean, he votes against it, and then now he wants to kind of see what, at least publicly is saying, he wants to see what's come out. Republicans don't take that same kind of view. And although this realization, I think, came earlier for me than for him, I think what we kind of see in 2021 is a shift in the Republican Party. And for listeners who are interested in going a little deeper, there's actually a political scientist, Aldridge, and he writes this really important book about thinking about party systems in the United States. And what he tries to do is he goes through and he looks and understands, right? In the United States, Ken and I, we've talked a bunch about how we have a two-party system because of the electoral system that we have. But that doesn't mean you always have the same exact two parties. Two parties can come and go inside of a two-party system. And even when an institutional party itself doesn't leave, the party itself can be transformed. And so party systems are the stable parties that exist in any particular time. I'm going to kind of say, and this is kind of both a backwards looking and a forwards facing prediction, is that I think, as you know, when Aldrich updates his book, or maybe I'll write it next time, somewhere here, I'm 2021 is as good in any to say that we see, and the Republican Party is fundamentally different. I don't think they're conservatives anymore, and I think if we're trying to make predictions about the future, that anyone's going to have to be kind of aware of that change moving forward. So Jan 6, Republican shift. Those are my big 2021 takeaways. What about for you, Ken? What do you have there, do you think?
Yeah, Trey, I agree quite a bit with your prediction. And I was thinking about this even in a global context. There's a recent a bunch of op-eds by Richard Pildes, who's a law professor who studies the law of democracy. And he was noting that he was putting this in a global context. And he was noting that in the European parliamentary systems where you have multiple parties, it was until fairly recently the case that the two major parties between them would get a very large majority of the vote. So in Germany, for instance, the two largest parties collectively 10 years ago were getting 90% of the vote, and the many third parties were splitting the other 10%. And that's really unraveled now to the point where the two major parties between them are just barely eking 60% of the vote, and the third parties are splitting 40%. And here in America, I think we're just seeing that manifest itself in a different way, that same impulse. But instead of seeing the actual emergence of third parties as electoral forces, we're seeing a lot of factionalism within the parties, really within both the Democrats and the Republicans. But I think right now, probably a bit more within the Republicans for the some of the reasons you talked about, that the faction that has sort of centered itself not so much on any particular substantive issue, but on a direct assault on democratic institutions, as exemplified on January 6th and through sort of late period Trumpism. That seems to be the faction with the most energy in the Republicans right now, and it seems pretty intent on squeezing out the older factions who had organized themselves around different kinds of issues and concerns. And so, I do agree we'll continue to see that. And I think, sadly, the Trump wing of the party is going to be dominant for some time, and maybe that's going to cause a little bit more unraveling of the rest of that party. My other prediction that I'll make, which maybe is related, is I'm going to predict that in the midterm elections coming up in 22, that although I'll agree with most pundits who are saying the Republicans are going to retake the House in November, I think that's going to happen without any increase in the number of Americans who cast votes for Republicans. So I think that's going to be done entirely through gerrymandering, and that the actual the votes cast will be not only majority Democrat, but significant majority Democrat. Like, I think Democrats will get probably 53% or 54% of the popular vote for congressional seats, but still find themselves in the minority after the election, entirely because of gerrymandering.
So I'll agree in part and disagree in part. So let's talk a little bit about the midterm, since you did that there. I think you're right. I mean, Republicans definitely win. And one of the things I think, and this is something that I'm always trying to hammer home to my intro students, is the importance of state elections on national outcomes, right? Because state elections determine those boundaries that you're talking about, right? They determine what that balance between parties, the likelihood of winning or losing can be. So I agree with you. And one of the things that I think that historically Democrats have in more modern times not been as effective at has been at the more local level. I don't think they've been particularly effective at the local level. They haven't won as many of those elections. And as a result, you're right, they're handicapped. Because they're not the ones drawing the boundaries, which traditionally is they did, not historically speaking, not too long ago. I would go further and say I don't think it's just going to be on the basis of gerrymandering, though. I mean, historically speaking, you do see that vote shift when you have a president in power, and based on what we think is going to happen economically, which is something else I think we'd like to talk about. I think that might even get a bigger uptick. In other words, when you're thinking about and trying to make predictions, you always ask, well, what's the base rate, right? Most things are not a coin flip. And so I would argue that the election isn't a coin flip. You're going to see as a base rate more Republicans come out to vote, but they certainly aren't going to be hurt. And on that front, I agree with you by having a control of a lot of state legislatures, and therefore having the ability to make boundaries that better suit their national victories.
Yeah, although there's not a symmetry between what the Democrats do and what the Republicans do when they're in control of a state. And there are a small handful of states where Democrats have gerrymandered for the benefit of Democrats, but the large majority of Democratic states have not gerrymandered. And I think this week we saw new maps come out in Michigan and in Virginia, and they're not gerrymandered. In Colorado, they're so not gerrymandered that it's actually possible Republicans might get a majority of the congressional seats there, despite being a minority, among the electorate. And so, if you compare that to states like Texas or Ohio or North Carolina or Pennsylvania, where the Republicans have been able to leverage small majorities among the electorate into large majorities, both in the state legislature and the Congress, I don't think you see Democrats making doing that in a similar way. And so I think the anti-democracy ideology of the contemporary Republican Party is part of the story of gerrymandering. It's not just that they're doing better in state and local elections.
I agree. And I think that kind of sets us up maybe for talking about one of our big move forward predictions. But before we hit that, why don't we take a brief break? Okay, so Ken, what you were arguing before we went into the break effectively is that we have to think about the different ways that Democrats and Republicans, at least contemporaneously, have handled map drawing when it comes to national congressional elections. And I think that's a fair point that we need to talk about. But I think it kind of fits in larger there because you had tied this to something that I had said at the beginning, thinking about Republicans and what they mean contemporaneously about the steal. Now, historically speaking, and that's what I was thinking about this, right? Once upon a time, both parties, when they controlled states, created maps that were beneficial for them. As a matter of fact, one of the big reasons for a lot of the voting organizations that exist today was effectively the truth that the map maker is the one who primarily determines elections. Now, for the Democratic Party, they kind of have a transformation in the contemporary period and suggest that, look, we need to have more democracy. Now, part of that, of course, could be tied into the fact that they saw that as being a winning path forward, right? This idea that they would, over the long term, win out in more mathematically fair electoral arrangements. And so they've made that push. Now, one possibility, and that's what you're suggesting, is that those pushes for fair don't result in fair. Colorado is actually, I think, a really great potential example of that. But that leads us into this question then of, in terms of the system that we have, how do we have the fairest one that we have? Or do Democrats need to go back to trying to gerrymander as they had, say, during the 1920s? So I'm curious. So what do you think about that? And then I got a broader question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in favor of democratic gerrymandering under current conditions, although I'm opposed to gerrymandering generally. But if I could write the laws, I would say that states like New York and California should amend their constitutions to link their map making process to that of other states, and they should say, well, if Ohio, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Pennsylvania are not having fair elections, then we're not going to have fair elections either. And if those states will go to fair elections, then we will go to fair elections. I think that's how I would do it.
That's kind of I like that you get there, but I think that's one of the things that's always kind of problematic. And what that is to determine what makes an election fair, right? So one possibility, and we've talked about this, is in a different kind of system. You're not voting in terms of particular districts. What makes our system particularly unique, because we have single member district parties, is a district fair because it has relatively equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans in it? In other words, what is the underlying thing that makes it fair? I think for many contemporary Democratic theorists, and I mean by that not the Democratic Party, but Democratic theorists, that the goal has been to have districts in which you have relatively equal numbers of both Republicans and Democrats. However, though, that leads precisely to what you're talking about in Colorado, because if you have a minority of one particular party and you create theoretically fair districts, you can give that party an outsized benefit by having internally fair, quote unquote, districts. What do you think about that? I've often thought about that. I don't have an answer to that question, but I've often thought about, this disconnect between the idea, what is in fact a fair district? And if a fair district is one in which you have equal numbers of both parties, i.e. it's competitive, what do you do in situations where you really don't have enough people to always make that happen? Well, you create, I think, a Colorado situation. But I don't know. I'm curious what you think about that.
Well, yeah, I don't think my concept of fair doesn't necessarily mean that you're trying to maximize the competitiveness in every district, but I think what it would mean is you're not doing artificial things like dividing political subdivisions. So say there's a county and that county has in it about the number of people that would belong in a congressional district. That's actually the case here in Hamilton County, Ohio. Yeah. So Hamilton County, Ohio, where I live, is like that. It's about the number of people in Hamilton County is about the same as the number of people in a congressional district. So to me, fair just means letting that county be a congressional district and not trying to cut it up in ways that dilute its impact. And now, if Hamilton County was a congressional district today, it wouldn't be that close. It would be a Democratic district. But to me, that's okay. I don't think it has to be cut up in ways to try to make every single district a battlefield district. But I think leaving existing political subdivisions intact and trying to make the shape of districts be compact and that kind of thing is good. There's some more sophisticated formulas that the fair elections people use, where they try to count what they sometimes call the wasted votes and say, like, how many votes have been put into a district that will essentially have no impact because of the district already being overwhelmingly one way or the other. And I guess maybe that matches around to what you were talking about, making more battlefield districts. In any case, what I think is the key here more than anything else is that there needs to be a more uniform national system, because you without me having all the answers to what system there is, it just simply doesn't work for Republican states to say, well, our system is we're trying to maximize the permanent number of Republican seats, and for Democratic states to say, well, our system is we're trying to make every district into a battlefield district. That leads to situations like we did have until the 2020 election, where you have majorities voting for Democrats, and yet the majorities being awarded to the Republicans. And I think in Wisconsin, actually, I forgot to mention Wisconsin, but the gerrymandering is so extreme there in the state legislature that the majority of voters in Wisconsin did vote for Democrats in the state legislature. But not only do the Republicans control both houses of the state legislature, they control it by supermajorities. They have supermajorities that can override the governor's veto, even though they're the minority party. And the majority party can't even defend a governor's veto. I mean, that's absurdly anti-democratic. And if that's going to be allowed in Wisconsin, then that's what should be happening also in Democratic states. And you could set up a state like Colorado so that there wouldn't be any Republican seats. Colorado hasn't chosen to do that. New York and California don't have a lot of Republican seats, but they actually could eliminate all their Republican seats. But they haven't chosen to do it.
See, I think one of the things that comes back to this, and this is where we probably have a shade of disagreement, is that if you're going to and we have a system in which we have states make these kind of determinations, I don't know how you get a national standard, right? So, and even if you did, then we would have to be able to answer those questions, and you would continue to have a, kind of national debate over what these districts would look like. To complicate what you're talking about, for example, the compactness, which I agree with you, that, compactness leads to maximizing a particular value. It can simultaneously, though, hinder other values. So in the American political system, one of the potential problems, especially when we've seen this in the South with compact districts, is that it disenfranchises African Americans in many ways because of the historic institutionalized racism of where people live. So, as you attempt to combat one particular problem with districts, it's not as if you get rid of these other potential problems with districts. And so different states end up answering those questions differently. Now, one possibility is, as you're suggesting, is to say, well, look, I think my team, the side I agree with, ought to do in their states what the other team does in their states. But for a variety of reasons, they've decided not to do that. So it seems weird to me then to say, well, if my team doesn't want to do it that way, I ought to force them to do it that way. I don't know. Talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, well, I'm not saying force them. I'm just saying that's
a
how
national
I would do
mandate.
it.
You're forcing them. If you're having Congress take it over and say, well, you got to create districts.
I would have. Yeah. So my first choice would be for Congress to take it over and require fair elections everywhere. I think that, Congress clearly has constitutional authority to do that. That's, for one thing, that's why we already have some legislation like the Voting Rights Act, which could go a lot farther. And also Congress has, even before the 14th Amendment, which would allow Congress to legislate to protect racial discrimination voting and things like that, protect against racial discrimination voting. The original Article 1 already, gives states the sort of chance to write the first drafts of electoral legislation, but it gives Congress the power to make exceptions and overrule state rules. So Congress could set uniform national standards for how districting has to be done. And I think that could be done along the lines of what actually has been done in states like Colorado and Virginia and Iowa. We have states that have good models, and so Congress could adopt those models and apply them nationally. And I think both as a matter of constitutional authority and as a matter of political morality, that would be the best solution. But if Congress isn't going to do that, then I think the second best solution would be for Democratic states to play hardball. If we're in a system that's a free-for-all and the Republican states are generally playing hardball, then the Democratic states also have to play hardball.
So why don't you think, I guess what I'm asking then is if that is so straightforward, then why don't you think Democratic states just do that?
I think the problem is that I think a lot of Democratic voters have an ideology that leads them to think fair elections are good things, and so they want that, and they don't have a complete understanding of how far we are from that in some Republican states. So I think they don't necessarily see it as an existential threat to democracy in America, which I think it is, that there's gerrymandering in one set of states and not another. They don't see the problem that way. Or, some people just, have a view that I don't have, that, the fact that other people are doing something wrong, two wrongs don't make a right, I guess, is a view that a lot of people have. That's not my view. I actually think two wrongs can be closer to a right than one wrong, but I think that's not a common view. So I think some people just think of it in the more traditional way. I
feel like that could be like a rock album or something. Two wrongs make a right. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah. Now, so in all seriousness, what I would like to kind of transition us from there here is to think about one of what I think is one of the biggest questions that's kind of facing us in America, and that is the durability of American democracy. Because I think in part what we're getting at here and arguing about is how the current way that states are implementing House elections are either advancing or hindering democratic institutions in the United States. But of course, that's not the only avenue in which to have this. So, as we're thinking kind of retrospectively at 2021 to look forward to 2022, I think the durability of American democracy is a huge question, and we're kind of dancing around that a little bit in a sense here. Why don't we just take it on, And we're not going to be the first people. I mean, the news and outlets are kind of awash in predictions of what happens next with American democracy. For those who I mean, again, I think we agree on this one. That a changed Republican Party, does that mean that we lose democracy? And I think for some it's kind of a bold and shocking claim, to the point where we kind of almost laugh it off, right? That can't be the case. But I was noticing this week that even Reason magazine, which Reason is a libertarian magazine, that tends to be a pretty radical on that kind of front. Even they had a really long piece on whether democracy can survive. Now, they think in kind of libertarian fashion that if we can learn to leave each other alone better, that we can learn to vote together. But I thought it was, again, just interesting that even Reason was having this. And so maybe one of the places where we can really sink our teeth into this question, Ken, was I noticed also this week, Senator Rand Paul. He's an individual I once had a tremendous amount of respect for, and I have slowly but surely lost that respect. This week on Twitter, he argued, and I had to look at this a number of times because I just didn't believe that could be what he was saying, but it was. What he argued is that the way that you steal elections, and this is how he's saying it, right? I'm not putting any words into his mouth. The way you steal elections is by helping people to vote legally. Yes, you help people to vote legally, and then you count those votes. So here's my question. In the face of things like that, it's hard for me to even fathom that here in 2021, we're arguing that a steal would be counting legal votes, right? And I think this goes along with you say, what does this mean for American democracy that a senator can be arguing that in a really visible, public, and authentic way? What do you think this means for the durability of American democracy? You were getting into that a little bit, so I just want to hit that as the question.
Yeah, well, I mean, on the one hand, I don't want to bet against the stability of the United States system of government. It has lasted 220 years. It's an enormous, mature democracy. Actually, 235 years by now.
There you go.
It's an enormous, mature democracy. There's incredible gravitational force holding it together despite these challenges. So I don't want to be an alarmist and say it's going to unravel, but I do think it's at its weakest point that it's been in a long time, and maybe since the Civil War, because it's not only the assaults on voting rights of the type that you've talked about. That's actually kind of old. I mean, if you think about American history, Rand Paul, it seems kind of shocking in the 21st century that he's saying, well, the problem is we let people vote and we count their votes. We wouldn't have any problems if we simply just denied people the vote and didn't count their votes. But that kind of talk actually would represent how American elections were run for a lot of American history. There's large groups of people we didn't let vote, and we still managed to have something that some semblance of democracy, and maybe even more democracy than other countries had. But I think what's a little bit new now, and I actually think this is more where if it's going to unravel, this is where I see it unraveling, is the January 6th plot, which it not only involved trying to suppress votes up front, but it also involved trying to arrogate to state legislatures the power to overrule popular elections when the state legislatures themselves are installed not through popular elections, but through gerrymandering, through the acts of prior state legislatures. So you have a state legislature that can entrench its own party in forever, no matter what the voters do. And then you have that state legislature purporting to throw out the votes of the legislators, of the voters, even in statewide elections, such as for president or possibly for U.S. senator. If you get to that point where not only are voting rights being suppressed, but where the outcomes of elections are being disregarded, I think that does pose an existential threat to democracy. I think if, for instance, a handful of state legislatures had followed John Eastman's bidding and had said, we're overruling the popular vote in our presidential election, we're sending a different slate of electors to the Electoral College than the one that was chosen by the voters on Election Day, and that's going to change the outcome of the presidential election and give us a different president than the one that was elected by the people. I think if that would happen, that would be such a transparent assault on American democracy, as opposed to assaults on voting rights, which are a little bit more invisible. That I think that could actually threaten the dissolution of the country. So I don't know if that's really going to happen, but I think that's the one kind of thing that could threaten the dissolution of the Union.
Well, I want to take on some more with that, Ken, but before I do, I'm actually going to need to stop us here for a second. This is going to be the end of our ad-supported preview, and I want to thank you so much for listening to our ad-supported preview. If you'd like to hear more of our conversation, my response to Ken about the American democracy, more about presidential predictions, more about Michael Flynn and other things, inflation, the economy, you can join us by becoming a supporter. You can become a supporter and listen to our full around 2-hour episode every week by heading to patreon.com/politicsguys. You can also support us through PayPal by going to politicsguys.com/support. Or finally, you can support us through Venmo, and we're at Politics Guys. So again, if you'd like to listen to the rest of the show, please become a supporter. We would love to have you. We'd love to continue the conversation. There's other benefits to being a supporter. And again, you can head to politicsguys.com/support. You can go to patreon.com/politicsguys, or you can find us on Venmo at Politics Guys. If for some reason you are not in a position to financially support the podcast right now, you can of course reach out to Mike at politicsguys.com, and he'll be able to set you up with full access to the show. Just let us know what's going on there. Thank you so much. And again, I hope that you will support the show and listen to the rest of the conversation.